Well, hello, Liz.
Hi,
Look
Brace.
at that, fellas. You need some advice out there. You can make a woman laugh just by saying her name and being shirtless on a Zoom call.
He's not shirtless. You have a shirt on. You have two shirts on.
This is paint. This is body paint I purchased for it's high price. They're running out of this stuff everywhere.
You know what's funny? Actually, they are really jacking the price up on a bunch of stuff. I was looking. This, like, a friend of mine posted on Instagram a bunch of, like, Sculpey magnets she made. Uh-huh. And I was like, oh, that's cute. And I went on Amazon and I was like, wonder if you could get, like, a Sculpey set. And they were selling one for $250.
Wow. I know. I bought a Scrabble board for $35.
How much is it usually?
I don't know. I've never bought one before. There's always just been in whatever house I moved into.
That's true. I feel like all houses should just come with Scrabble.
You know, I've recently become a black powder man for my.
Excuse me?
Well, I'm always a black powder man, but a black powder man for my ammunition. I've been making my own ammunition. Okay.
Oh boy, here we go.
And I'm thinking of just starting to sell it at the liquor store or something. Start like kind of a small. You know how like girls got really into crafts in like 2008.
Yeah, this is your dude's craft.
Fellas, we are making our own ammunition for black powder weapons now.
You're an entrepreneur.
Dude, I got billionaire mindset.
Hashtag guide boss.
I've been getting a lot of billionaire mindset like YouTube ads. I don't know if women get these. You guys probably get fit. This is like
I don't even know what that is. What's billionaire mindset?
Are you familiar with Fit Tea?
Yes.
So there's a version of Fit Tea for men called Billionaire Mindset. It's not like, it doesn't keep you thin. It doesn't, I don't know what Fit Tea does to you, but probably nothing good. It's a series of videos where a man stands in front of nice cars and tells you to have a certain kind of mindset. And then he talks about passive income, which I think means investments. Anyways, if you're a fella, you are getting these videos every 2 minutes, even if, you don't have any sort of mindset. I have a mindset, but my mindset has put me on the trail of the Holy Grail. It's not put me on the trail of being a billionaire.
Why are those could be related?
If I find the Grail, sweetheart, do you know if a Jew's hands if I ensconce the Grail between my calloused fingers and I hunch over like this and I sup from it, it will have effects that no man can predict.
Oh boy.
That's where I must. I'm on. You know, I'm calling you from the plane to Iceland right now.
You got Grail mindset.
Mm-hmm. I've been reading the Edda, baby.
Grail boss.
I'm a Grail boss.
Here we are once again.
Welcome to the Inner Zone, motherfuckers.
No, welcome to TrueAnon. I'm Liz.
I'm Brace, joined by producer Young Chomsky.
What do we got going today, Brace?
I'm so juiced for this.
I know.
We are interviewing the Recluse. That's right, baby. We finally got him.
Can you explain?
Well, all right. The Recluse, he revealed himself, although he still, I believe, goes by the Recluse. This is Steven Snider from VISUPview.blogspot.com, which is a fantastic resource for anybody with Epstein brain or any sort of, any kind of brain. It is a fantastic website, which, let me just read from the header. This dedicated to exploring the vast Fortean realms of mind control, deep politics, sacred geometry, onomatology, and synchronicity, occult films and music, the supernatural, the extraterrestrial, and the multidimensional, high weirdness in all its many forms.
Yeah, it's interesting timing because I don't know if all of our listeners know this, but just a couple days ago, we were accused of being a Nazi podcast.
Yes, apparently some goys don't like the fact that me and my fellow Jewish podcasters joke about being Jewish.
Well, we had to give it to them. So they called us a Nazi podcast. So we said, any lesser podcast would say, what are you talking about? But you know what we say on TrueAnon? You want a Nazi podcast? We'll give you a Nazi podcast.
You think, motherfucker, you think because you got a Proud Boy fired from Pet Boys? Motherfucker, I am tracking down Klaus Barbie.
Yeah, so we're talking what? Fascist international, neo-Nazi cabal.
Absolutely. Let's get this bad boy rolling. Welcome to our main event. I'm very excited about this this episode. As many people have known, I have been on my quest for the Grail, and through that I have been battling the post-war Nazis and reading my way through what's going on with them. And with us to help with that task, we have the Recluse, Stephen Snider himself, of VISUPview.blogspot.com. And Stephen, you have a book out as well, right?
Yes, sir. It is Strange Tales of the Parapolitical, Post-War Nazis, Mercenaries, and Other Secret History.
Stephen, so before we get into what the really meat of what we're talking about, VISUP View, I read it, many people I know read it, but what is it? What is the purpose of the blog?
Well, it's changed quite a bit over the years. Ironically, it actually was kind of started as primarily a paranormal investigation thing back in 2010, I think it was. The VISUP is Volusia Investigative Society of Unexplained Phenomena. Obviously, it's going far beyond that purpose over the years.
Yes.
Kind of lost touch with it somewhat. I mean, I'm still into a lot of the paranormal and the high weirdness stuff too, but I mean, certainly for the last 7-8 years or so, it became more of a parapolitical oriented blog, but I almost kind of inevitably find myself being drawn back to the paranormal and the occult and so forth to try to ultimately explain many of the geopolitical things I'm looking at, so kind of goes full circle, I suppose.
Yeah, I've been reading a bunch of sort of early Lavenda to prepare for this. So I've been getting through Unholy Alliance, which has definitely, I believe, put me in the right mindset. So what we're talking about today are Nazis. Specifically, the Nazis who decided at the end of World War II that they didn't want to either blow their brains out or work for the Soviets or get captured by the Soviets, but they wanted to go to South America. Now, can you explain to me what exactly all this was going on? There's the rat lines, there's people who got there on certain kind of strange passports, but really, what was the scale of the sort of Nazis who went to South America?
Well, I mean, it was certainly pretty significant, and I mean, there were several waves. Of course, the plans for this, kind of transference had begun even before the war had ended around probably 1943 or so. Certain figures within the SS had started to come to the conclusion that they probably would not prevail. Of course, with the mindset that prevailed in Nazi Germany, that really wasn't something that you wanted to put into writing, so to speak. So a lot of it was kind of done covertly, setting up, kind of the transference of assets and so forth. They used a lot of companies and that type of thing to manage this. And then, of course, as the war was winding down, you started to see an uptick in assets being transferred out. One of the big ones, for instance, was Sofindus, Sofindus. That was the abbreviation of the company, but some Spanish name that I do not recall off the top of my head. But essentially, it was run by a full-blown SD asset, which was the Foreign Intelligence Service of the SS. And, one of the major figures, Carlos Fonder, I believe, had been an early guy involved with Sofindus, and then he kind of later took on the actual transference, the rat lines from Spain into South America and so forth. But, I mean, you kind of had this, a lot of these just massive amounts of gold, tons and tons of it being transferred in the final days of the war to kind of, set up a nest egg for these post-war activities, essentially. And then, of course, in the immediate following aftermath of the war, the British and the U.S., and to some extent the Vatican, all started to get involved in this as well, as there was, kind of a mad dash for assets.
Yes.
What was it specifically about South America that made it such a, key destination?
Well, I mean, for one thing, the Germans had already had a lot of business dealings and what have you in South America. In the years leading up to the war. Of course, in countries like Argentina, you already had kind of large German populations living there. And I mean, I've obviously never been there, but I mean, I've heard areas in the southern cone, like Chile and what have you, are, fairly similar, in terms of just the landscape, the climate, and so forth to Germany. So, I'm sure there was probably a certain appeal with that too. But, there were a lot of benefits to it. And then certainly too, a lot of the regimes down there were very receptive to the Nazis. I mean, they had already had dealings with them the years leading up to, the end of the war, and, all these technical skills and so forth were suddenly looking for a new home. And, a lot of people thought this was a great way to maybe advance their industrial capabilities, scientific, so on, and that type of thing.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of people don't know this, but Ernst Röhm was a military advisor in South America. I can't remember exactly which country, during the 1920s. And in fact, some of these countries had such large, German populations. Originally, a lot of Jews who were escaping the Nazis, and then ironically, a lot of Nazis came down there. But I believe that the Nazi Party had its own section specifically for Argentina and Brazil that had basically replicated the German Nazi Party in full and took total command of them, which is really wild if you think about it. And so a lot of these kind of big name guys fled to there. I mean, most famously, Joseph Mengele, but other ones too, like Klaus Barbie and of course Adolf Eichmann. These guys found a pretty receptive environment, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially with Perón in Argentina, there was pretty much the red carpet full-blown rolling out for them.
Yes.
I mean, there definitely was not a lot of protest, especially in the Southern Cone, to their presence there, certainly.
Yeah, and it's I think one way I've heard it explained is that in South America, there were not a lot of Jews, but there were a lot of communists. And so we see what kind of became true everywhere is that this basically assault on Jews became, I mean, obviously the Nazis were extremely anti-communist, but the anti-communism really became, first and foremost the goal of the post-war Nazis. And a lot of these guys sort of integrated with I know you've written about the World Anti-Communist League, and organizations such as that as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, and it wasn't just, the German Nazis that were fleeing either.
Yeah.
I mean, you ended up with a lot of the Quislings. I know there was actually, I believe, a pretty big colony of French collaborators, if I remember correctly, that had been set up in Argentina in the aftermath of the war. So, I mean, there were a lot of these, former, quote-unquote, former fascist Nazis, wandering around there. And, in the case of, again, the French, it wasn't even necessarily the anti-Semiticism that was a driving factor. I mean, the French fascist movements had really just kind of embraced that more to appease the Germans, in the aftermath of after they had been defeated. A lot of these guys, their kind of pretext had always been anti-communism from the beginning. So at some extent that became more prevalent, especially when obviously just the German racial policies and so forth were just simply untenable in the post-war years. So, you needed something to rally the troops around.
Yeah, and you can be racist in South America. You just have to have a more diverse view of racism. Instead of Europe, where you can only be racist against a few people, in South America, you have a lot to choose from. So you sort of got to, regurgitate mix all around, make a new sort of stew. And one of these countries where pre-war there were several actual Nazi pre-World War II, this country had several Nazi parties of their own, including hosting, I believe, a Brazilian one as well, was Chile. And in Chile, there was a little something called Colonia Dignidad. And could you give us a little primer on that real quick, just the sort of base around that?
Well, it emerged at some point in the early 60s, 61, 62, somewhere thereabouts. Most of the individuals there were pretty much all German nationals. They had moved, and it wasn't all one big move. There had been several waves of it in the early 60s. Essentially, they had ended up with a rather large compound in the southern part of the state. It was, theoretically a kind of agricultural experiment that was supposed to be self-sustaining. They had their own factories. They had a lot of farmland and so forth. The villages were kind of set up in a traditional Bavarian fashion, and everybody, wore historic clothing. It was, a bit of a LARP, I suppose, in some levels.
Are we talking Lederhosen here?
Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, it was
God.
kind of meant to look like one of those, propaganda videos from Nazi Germany when they went out into the countryside and everybody was dancing in the fields.
So it's sort of like, how people dress up like Spider-Man and go to the conventions because they like Spider-Man? This is similar to these are Bavarian LARPers, I guess. They saw a Leni Riefenstahl
It's
movie.
like Comic-Con.
Yeah, very
it's
much
Comic-Con
so.
for guys who like Leni Riefenstahl instead of Marvel.
Yeah.
I mean, really just very much a romanticism for the way that, things essentially existed in this idealistic, pre-industrial state before, the decay of the cities and the, influx of foreigners that this had brought and that type of thing. So, yeah, and I mean, in a lot of ways it was very much an escape from Europe, when in a lot of senses it was seen as split between the U.S. and the Soviets, and of course a lot of them didn't like the presence of the Americans there, with many African-American soldiers and that type of thing. So, I mean, it was a way to kind of retreat from the outside world, try to set up something that was pure, that would be distant and isolated, and it could flourish and survive, at least in theory. But yeah, and of course, there was all the, staples of cult indoctrination, 12 to 14-hour work days. The sexes were rigorously separated. There was, a lot of effort taken to ensure that there wasn't sexual activity or really romantic ones of any type. And then, of course, there was the hallmark of group confessions. I mean, a lot of times they were divided up into dormitories. At the end of each week, you had to get up and, in front of everybody and expose your sins and go through the whole process of group humiliation and public shaming and all that good stuff. So, yeah. And then, of course, I mean, they had more serious methods involving drugs, electroshock therapy, and all that good stuff that was already being toyed with, I believe, by at least the late 60s.
Yeah, and it's funny because it's sort of like you start talking about it and you're like, see, it was just supposed to be this idyllic, like you say, Bavarian oasis. And then it's like, but also it was a crazy cult. And also, as, we kind of like get further into the history, it's like, became like a key part of the Pinochet regime with all of the detention camps.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, even beyond that, Operation Condor in general, which really combined the intelligence services across the Southern Cone. So
hold up, not to interrupt you, but for those of our listeners who don't know, people who might have been searching for another podcast by mistake, people who just listen to us at the gym for white noise, can you please explain to them, what is Operation Condor?
Well, Condor was a program that was initiated by several of the different intelligence services in the Southern Cone, though really Chile was the driving force behind it. And at this particular time in history, there were, Marxist insurgencies in practically every country in the Southern Cone. And the way a lot of these guys were able to sustain their movements is when things became too hot in the country, where the government they were trying to overthrow, they would just cross the border, hide out there, and, wait till things died down. So a lot of these intelligence services, they wanted to be able to pursue them across borders, essentially. So this started as an arrangement where, okay, you've got a rebel group in Argentina and they flee into Chile. Well, the Chilean service will go and arrest them, or maybe the Argentinians can just cross over to the border and kill them themselves, but we'll figure out a way to eliminate them. So essentially there would be nowhere in the entire Southern Cone that they could hide whatsoever. Yeah. And it was so successful that they decided to expand it really to the entire world. So now you start seeing assassinations carried out in Europe, in the United States, where now essentially they wanted to put the mindset into everyone that there's nowhere you could hide from us. We will track you down to the ends of the earth and we will kill you there.
I think one of the things that's really interesting about Condor is because it's happening also concurrently along with Operation Gladio in Europe, but it really is like, I mean, it's a combination of basically every scumbag in the Western Hemisphere and the Southwestern Hemisphere getting together. I mean, there are Cuban exiles. There's Pinochet. There's Klaus fucking Barbie. It's really astounding. It was pretty effective too.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, on top of that, especially when you look at like the Italian neo-fascists and what have you, people like
Yes.
Stefano del Sayac and what have you. I mean, these guys were basically, I mean, they were involved in the Gladio type operations in Italy, and then when they started to draw too much attention from the authorities, many of them were giving refuge in the southern cone of South America, and then they went to work again on the stuff with Condor and what have you. So, on top of everything else, there was direct overlap with the assets as well. So, I mean, a lot of these guys, like you're saying, I mean, it's basically a collection of almost every scumbag on the planet at the time, and they're all kind of involved in these different programs and what have you. And then in the case of, what was it, Agenter Press, was a quote-unquote press service that was set up in Lisbon in Portugal. It was comprised of all these, veterans from the OAS, the French types who had failed.
Journalist service?
Yeah. Well, it was essentially, okay, when you get into covert operations, there are two different facets of it, okay? You've got the paramilitary end, which is all the special operations forces guys and what have you. But at the other hand, you have psychological warfare specialists, which is closely entwined with all this. The British invented this, and when it was all, it originated with the Ministry of Economic Warfare, and you had the political warfare executive and the special operations executive in the same body. And these things were combined for a simple reason. Because you can go out into the countryside and assassinate an official, but if you don't have a Psy-War specialist to put it into context, you don't get the full effect out of it.
Right, totally.
And that all was combined in a place like Agenter, which was a totally private operation, essentially. I mean, it got funding from the Portuguese intelligence services, but it got funding from a lot of other sources as well. And most of these guys, they were French, they were former Nazis, there were these neo-fascist Italians there, pretty much a smorgasbord of rightists from across the world involved in it. And it poses as a press service. It put a lot of effort into penetrating the communists, especially those associated with the Chinese and what have you.
Yep.
So it's a big psychological warfare operation. And from the French perspective, specifically, it's to intoxicate these groups. That was the way they thought of it, essentially.
Intoxicate?
Yes, intoxication.
Now that's the job of podcasters.
Well, in the French perspective, intoxication in this sense essentially meant the poisoning of the mind, effectively.
Okay,
So
yeah,
French,
podcasters.
too. That's such a French way of putting all of it.
Yes.
It's like it always has to be the most romantic version of something.
So,
Go on.
So these Agenter guys, I mean, they got their press service, they're doing all their Psy-War stuff, intoxicating the mind, poisoning the mind, and so on. But then they're also involved in carrying out terrorist operations. I mean, most of the OAS guys were veterans of the paratroopers in the French Foreign Legion, the 11th Shock Brigade.
Could you explain what OAS is to people?
I'm not going to try to butcher
not
the French pronunciation,
whole
but
thing.
it's the Secret Army organization. Okay,
Yes, the English version of it. Yes.
Okay, so this goes into the Algerian War. Okay, so de Gaulle comes to power after there had been a lot of public dispute in France as to whether or not the Algerian War was worth it or not. Everybody thought de Gaulle was going to push ahead and win the war, and then he comes to power and he decided to pull the French out and grant Algeria their freedom. That was very unpopular with certain aspects of the French military, and
the Pied Noir too, right?
Oh yeah, well those were the French Algerians there, who essentially had been organized into terror brigades and what have you, in the cities and what have you, to attack Arabs and whatnot. So it was all very nasty. But anyway, so portions of the French military revolt against de Gaulle, and they were pretty much all either Psy-War officers or they were the special operations guys from the 11th Shock Brigade, from the paratroopers and the French Foreign Legion and so forth. They go out and square off against de Gaulle, and it was a brutal conflict from 61 to 63. De Gaulle had essentially his own stay-behind network, the SAC, that was loyal to him, the Service Action Clique, or whatever it was called. And these guys basically had a covert war against each other. They're running around assassinating each other, assassinating their families, and so on and so forth. Of course, they tried to assassinate de Gaulle, 6 or 7 times or something. So
I will say, too many times for me to believe that, at least some of these guys weren't idiots. I mean, or were idiots, because 6 or 7 times, it's like, come on.
Well, I mean, you got to remember though, de Gaulle, I mean, he was a serious military guy.
Yeah.
And I mean, his, like I said, that SAC group, I mean, those guys were extremely powerful. And I mean, they really continued to dominate the country for years afterwards. I mean, this is why de Gaullists really had control of France up until the early 20th century, when really they just started to die out. And I think it's partly because they just still had control of this de Gaullist, stay behind network, the SAC, that had been, there to essentially ensure the the powerhouse of France and the European Union and the de Gaullist vision of this throughout the 20th century. But so anyway, these guys are defeated, and they decided to carry the war on. In the case of some guys like Yves Geiserik, they were going to carry it on to its proper dimension, which encompassed the entire planet, essentially. So yes, they set up in Portugal, and they essentially became great mercenaries of the right. You see them showing up all across the world. And in the case of Ginter, I mean, they carried out acts of terrorism in Italy, in northern or southern Africa, to help sustain the Portuguese colonies there. They were brought into Chile. They were apparently even used to train troops in Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken.
So they're just basically hired guns at this point.
Yeah, well, I mean, on top of that, the French counterinsurgency doctrine, le guerre révolutionnaire, revolutionary warfare, was profoundly influential, okay? I mean, it was developed essentially during the French Indochina War, studying the tactics of Mao Zedong and so forth. And they essentially came to the conclusion that the only way they could defeat communism was becoming even more brutal than the communists themselves. And, that was all...
Reminds one of Operation Phoenix.
Well, I'm getting to that in a second. So,
excuse me.
So anyway, these methods were all rolled out in Algeria to glorious effect. You had the pioneering use of the helicopter ride. You would abduct somebody from the street. They would be tortured brutally for 24 hours, usually with the beloved water pipe method, which we now know as waterboarding. And then after the 24-hour period had passed, it was deemed that they didn't have useful intelligence now. So it was time for them to commit suicide. And they did that by being flown out in a helicopter in the Mediterranean and thrown into the sea. The thinking being that the body would then wash up on shore and it would traumatize everybody even more. So, you got the full effect of the deed.
Right. It's like that's the mob move.
Yeah.
That's why so much of this does remind one, especially, you're talking about the sort of secret war that was going on in France, low-grade civil war between the OAS, between the sort of anti-Gaullist officers and the Gaullist sort of secret militias. And it really does remind me, they're machine gunning cars, they're blowing up, they're putting car bombs in. And yeah, I don't know. It's just, it's very similar to mob tactics.
Oh, yeah. Well, again, the French security services had a lot of overlap for years with the Caucasian Brotherhood, the French Mafia, essentially, who controlled... Well, this is why the French Connection, for years was called the French Connection, because it was the French mob, essentially, that controlled the flow of heroin from Indochina into, Europe and so on and so forth. But okay, so getting back to, just for a second, for the Le Guerre revolutionary specialists, these guys, de Gaulle didn't trust them, even the ones that hadn't sided with the OAS, so he started sending them around the world, essentially, to get them out of the country.
Good move, that's smart.
But see, these guys, they end up going to the States, they start training the Green Berets, they start influencing a lot of the CIA officers, set up the Phoenix program. They get sent to Chile. They start training the military there. They start training the troops in Argentina. And then suddenly you see Condor emerging, which essentially is using a lot of the same tactics that they used. They start, like I said, they hooked up with all the Italian Neo Fascists through a Ginter press. These are the guys that weren't officially working for de Gaulle. They start passing on the concepts of the guerre revolutionnaire to them, and that's kind of what leads to the strategy of tension in Italy. So that's, really the amazing thing that I really uncovered in researching my book was that Phoenix, the Gladio stuff, the strategy of tension, Operation Condor, almost all of this had its origins in the counterinsurgency methods of the French, honestly.
Yeah, it's interesting too when, I think the story that at least, popular in America or American universities, the story that gets told about Pinochet in particular, if this story gets told about Pinochet in particular, setting that aside, right, is that, when they talk about U.S. influence down there, they really only mention the kind of economic, the Chicago boys and the kind of like new neoliberal consensus coming in. But like very little is remarked on about these institutions that were building up for a long time, in Chile and as, throughout South America that became like key, not just like training centers. I mean, just to get back to, I guess I'm, circling back to Dignidad right now, but became like key counter revolutionary training centers and basically torture sites.
Yeah, very much. And then, of course, it wasn't even just the French either that were training the militaries, but it had been a lot of, different European empires and then to some extent the United States as well. But what it amounted to is essentially in the Southern Cone, the military was very right-wing and it tended to associate itself as being much more European than Latin American or anything to that effect. So that was one of the big reasons why, the anti-communist activities were so effective in the first place in South America, as you already had kind of a rock of ages, so to speak, with the militaries in these different countries already there as kind of a beachhead to begin with. And then, like you're saying, you get all of these different other groups that were moving in, especially in the aftermath of the Second World War. So, it really, kind of became a perfect storm by the 70s almost.
And the Chilean security services, in particular, DINA, which don't ask me what that stands for. Please don't do that to me. But it was actually headed by a guy in the 70s named Manuel Contreras, who himself had been he was sort of like a Germanophile. There's a few files, involved in this, but he had been, I believe, maybe part of either pro-German groups or pro-Nazi groups during the Second World War, before the Second World War. And he comes to power, and he's in charge of the, the security services of Chile, which were very powerful, but they were as brutal as their counterparts in other countries, but they don't have the same body count. And I think people rack that up to them not needing to, but they actually employed some pretty, they really refined these methods, right?
Oh yeah, well that's, one of the most disturbing things about all of it. It was methodical. It was, in a sense, very scientific. Of course you had the immediate aftermath of the coup. A lot of potential dissidents were rounded up. In a lot of cases they were sent to the major football stadium they had there. You had the whole spectacle with the lights being shown on them and the white noise and just people being randomly taken out and executed. And then you had sort of the whole caravan of death that was traveling around the country, executing people in different townships. And I just think that, because the response at the beginning was just so overwhelming, it really put the country into almost a national stupor. People were justifiably horrified by what they were seeing. And then, as a kind of second level, you had places like the Colony, which, became almost a kind of mythological boogeyman in the countryside. People had to be the fear of being abducted, of being taken to this terrible place where they would be tortured and so forth, and quite likely disappeared to ultimately.
I know you mentioned sort of strange, almost occult practices of the Colony. And that does remind one of that there was a bunch of colonies in South America set up by, let's say, non-South Americans. There are some similarities here to Jonestown too. Big charismatic leader brings a bunch of generally poor people from his country of origin down there and tortures them. Obviously, Jonestown, everyone, for one reason or another, from one, maybe perpetrator or another, died, but not the same at Colonia Dignidad. But there is this weird pull that people have to go down there and to start these colonies.
Yeah, well, it was, of course, obviously land there was very cheap. It was easy to find, vast isolated areas. In many cases, many of the locals in these regions would still be natives. They didn't, obviously back in the 60s and 70s, they didn't have the, easiest way to communicate to the outside world what exactly was going on there. And yeah, even though, nominally you look at a place like Jonestown, the Colony, they seem very different, but the methods are strikingly similar. Again, you've got the long work days, you've got the group confessions, the separation of the sexes and what have you, the just general attempts to prevent the congregations from even having sex in the first place. In fact, in both cases, really, it was the cult leader that was having most of the sex. And it was
but funny how that works. That always ends up working out that way.
Well, I will say the cult leader of Colonia Dignidad was not. He was As goes with the theme of this show, he was a pedophile, it appears. But the weird thing at Colonia Dignidad I was reading about is actually you had to go. The head of it was a guy named Paul Schaefer, which I know you know, but our listeners might not. And you had to actually ask him permission to get married. And you might have somebody in mind, but it was described as like roulette. You might get that person, but more often than not, he is going to now make you marry somebody who is not only far above child rearing age, but maybe in their 60s or 70s where you're like 20 years old.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was a common tactic. I mean, yes, I mean, essentially even trying to make a marriage essentially as, joyless as possible.
Yes.
And also, I mean, of course, this prevented them from having kids, which was another thing that, there was an obsession with trying to prevent the actual members from having kids. But on the flip side of the coin, you had orphans potentially being brought over from Germany. I mean, that was something that they were investigated for. There were allegations for years that kids in the countryside in Chile had disappeared near the colony. Certainly, as you alluded to, Paul Schaefer was an arch pedophile. Abuser of children. I mean, I think several hundred charges actually of sexual abuse against kids. He was ultimately, brought against him in the mid 90s. It was a lot of kids over many years, and the members weren't producing them. So, I mean, they had to be brought in from somewhere. That's another kind of scandal. I don't think we've ever really, determined exactly where all these kids were coming from in the first place or what happened to some of them.
That's the thing you notice that Recluse here said in the 90s he was charged because Colonia Dignidad went on for quite a long time, including after, obviously, the fall of the Pinochet regime. And the Chilean government had some definitely difficulties closing it down because Schaefer had garnered a lot of power, but this place was also like an armed camp. I mean, they had barbed wire, they had concrete walls, they had advanced communication systems, and possibly a chemical weapons lab, or at least a chemical lab, and they made their own guns, and they were connected by a guy who I have read on your website about and many other places, Michael Townley. Can you tell us a little about Townley?
Well, Townley was an American. There's been a lot of speculation for years that he had intelligence connections. I mean, that's never really been definitively proven, but obviously it seems pretty certain that he was some kind of liaisons between the U.S. intelligence community and the DINA, which he ultimately became a member of. But even before then, I mean, he had been involved in these kind of fascist organizations in Chile that had been working to essentially pave the way for the overthrow of Allende in 1973. I mean, a lot of them they were essentially kind of brown shirt type organizations. They had gone around and, committed minor acts of terrorism, street crime, that type of thing. That had actually forced him into exile for a little while. And then after the coup, he was brought back. He went to work for the DINA and he became essentially the principal liaisons with the colony. But I mean, a lot of other international fascist groups as well, of course. I think he was the guy who handled the Cubans, if I remember correctly, and he definitely was the major point of contact with a lot of the Italian Neo Fascists as well. So I mean, he was a big cog in the international network that really came to roost, so to speak, in Chile during Pinochet's regime.
Yeah, and he might have actually been involved in the bombing of the Allende's former foreign minister, right, in America.
Oh, yeah, quite possibly. Yeah, the murder in Embassy Row. Yeah, I think he was one of the guys. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think he mainly avoided charges because he had, testified essentially against other individuals in the DINA or something to that effect. And to get, immunity going.
The classic rats move. Mm.
So, yeah. Well, I mean, also, too, potentially as well, just as a sleeper agent effectively for the CIA, a double agent, whatever you want to call it. So he's keeping tabs on everything. And then finally, when they did something that was a little embarrassing to the CIA, well, now he can testify against them. Yeah. And
they killed a general, too, I believe, in Italy as well. Why do everyone loves, I gotta say, fascists and the CIA, basically every bad guy loves murdering people on Italian soil.
Well, so does the mob too. So,
yeah, exactly. Everybody.
But they failed to kill the general. Actually, probably they should have used the mafia for that one. It was the reason why they shot him in the head, but they used like a large caliber pistol, and that's something that, the mob knows well. You always use a 22 or something like that because there's no exit wound. The bullet just ricochets around in the skull and pierces the brain from multiple angles. But I believe the Italian fascist who did that was severely reprimanded because he didn't use a 22. But yeah, the general managed to survive being shot in the head, but needless to say, he was not involved in politics very much after that.
Yes, I will say, just this is totally unrelated, basically. Well, not entirely, but mostly unrelated to what we're talking about. A lot of these Italian fascists, and a lot of these guys around now, actually, this guy's made a comeback, love Julius Evola. And I'm saying, if you are this big Evola guy and you believe in this, heroic, whatever, I mean, it's all bullshit, aristocratic shit. You are like, I'm sorry, you're working as a pawn for fucking Western intelligence, you jackass. You're not some fucking hero, whatever. I'm not a big fan of Evola.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, that's actually why a lot of the major Italian neo-fascists came to distrust Evola after a while, because they essentially became convinced that his ideology was being used to keep them within the Western alliance and what have you. I mean, of course, you stand around here and talk about how the United States is just as bad as the Soviet Union and so on and so forth, but then it's like, well, but we're going to keep working with the Italian security services, even though we know they're under the dominion of the CIA, and what we're essentially doing is keeping Italy in the Western alliance, but that's okay. We're just biding our time for the big move down the road.
That's like the classic logic of like, no, we're being strategic. Just wait. I swear we've got a plan.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what a lot of these Nazis did post-war. I mean, a lot of these guys still did have like an allegiance to there wasn't a Reich anymore, but to the general idea. But then, like so many other, dreamers and starry-eyed fucking losers, they basically became in a lot of ways pawns. I mean, if you look at the post-war landscape, it is basically an invisible web across the entire world of these, organizations or these mercenary groups or, what have you, intelligence agencies that are really all combined into basically one anti-communist mission with many different, let's say, submissions as well. I mean, the Cuban exiles went a long way from trying to overthrow Castro into basically becoming mercenaries. And that seems to be the case with a lot of these guys.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that also led to a lot of curious situations in the Cold War. I mean, especially with Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando,
yes.
The guy who had rescued Mussolini with a hand glider or something to that effect.
Scarface.
Oh my God.
Yes. And,
he actually was the guy who came up with dressing up in American uniforms during the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah. They wore enemy uniforms to ambush our troops. Oh yeah, no, I mean, just a wonderful guy. He was also. I went to the International Spy Museum in Washington D.C. For my honeymoon, and they have this whole display in the James Bond section about how Skorzeny was the inspiration for the main guy who was behind Spectre, Bloomfield or something like that. That Spectre had essentially been like modeled upon the post-war networks Skorzeny had set up. But I mean, the thing with him, okay, so he famously was used to supply Nazi mercenaries and scientists and what have you to Nasser in Egypt at behest of the CIA. But the thing is, a lot of the guys he recruited were from the Eastern Bloc of Germany. And I mean, this was known, I mean, he had like advertisements in newspapers and what have you for these guys. And then you get into just the bizarre situation in Algeria where on the one hand, he's working with the OAS and, the Red Hand, these kind of terror organizations and what have you. But then on the flip side of the coin, he's selling arms to the FLN, which was the rebel group opposing the French there.
That's my type. Where you got to be just like wheeling and dealing on both sides, constantly moving and grooving.
Well, he started that. He started one of the first kind of, not the first, but really an official mercenary organization with an American soldier in Spain.
Yeah, the Paladin group. Yeah, that was definitely one of the earlier ones. And I mean, again, it brought in a lot of these different guys, OAS veterans, a lot of the Italian neo-fascists, like you're saying. They even had some Americans involved with it. And again, I mean, they provide services all over the world, including I think even Vietnam, some other stuff. So Yeah, but I mean, like I said, on top of that, though, I mean, the guy had no qualms whatsoever about collaborating with the Soviets. Hell, I mean, he sold out other Nazis to the Israelis. So-
Yes. Yeah, well, he was the crazy thing about Skorzeny is Skorzeny, by the way, Skorzeny was a true believer, but he was a, let's say, malleable true believer. Like young Nazis, young skinhead guys all over the West Europe would come and sort of pay homage to him in Spain. But then he was also, supplying guns to basically whoever would buy them.
Yes.
It's not, and the Israelis hired him, possibly. I mean, they don't know for sure, but it's like the Townley situation where it looks pretty certain that the Israelis actually hired Michael Skorzeny to carry out some jobs.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, and it's insane because, I mean, on the other hand, I mean, he was also the one supplying arms to a lot of Arab groups that were opposed to Israel. But yeah, like you're saying, then he turns around, he'll sell weapons to the Israelis. I mean, he'll help them assassinate other officials. And just,
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you know.
He actually, in this, I read this book, The Beast Reawakens, and they're describing his clients, and it's all these, like, neo-fascist, fascist, right-wing groups. And then it's also the PFLP external command. It's like a split for the PFLP, the Palestinian Liberation, like, communist group. Mm-hmm. Who, I mean, the fact that they were being trained by him, I don't know. I mean, maybe you might want to read into that because a lot of intelligence linked to that group. But it's astounding. These groups were able to operate basically worldwide with impunity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of people found them to be very useful in the aftermath of the war, certainly. The connections that they had established. I mean, especially in the Arab world, which was, I think, really, a major appeal to the Americans going into the Cold War, because we really didn't have a lot of experience in the Arab world outside of Saudi Arabia up to that point. I mean, that had, historically been the dominion of the European powers and so forth. So, we were looking to get influence, and the Germans, of course, we had just defeated them. We've basically taken a lot of them into the roles of our intelligence services. So, they have the contacts that we needed. And I kind of think, you see some of that again, with the situation with Nasser. We, even though Nasser had shown a lot of overtures to the Soviets, we were still interested in propping him up because it would give us access to Suez and just the whole area and get the French and the British out, even though they were essentially our allies. So, yeah, just a lot of just kind of Machiavellian ploys going on behind all of this. It's something I definitely have been getting into a lot in the book I'm working on now, A Special Relationship, which is going to, kind of chronicle the history of these blackmail rings, the sexual blackmail rings with Epstein going back to the British and what have you. So, yeah, I mean, it's just really fascinating. The British were obsessed with keeping their influence in the Arabic world in the aftermath of the war, and just continuously the U.S. was trying to undermine them on the one hand to get access to the oil and so on and so forth. But on the flip side of the coin, we still needed the manpower and the expertise that the British provided us. So it was kind of it was definitely a balancing act.
I think it's worth I think it's worth talking about what happened to these guys, because especially after the kind of fall of the Pinochet regime, there was this sort of attempt to bring some people to justice, right? And that didn't work out so well. Most people got what we would call disappeared in the 90s. But it was sort of like a great scattering, it seems like.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, Schaefer, of course, fled Chile in the aftermath. I think he was, hiding out in Argentina or something like that for quite a few years.
Argentina.
I think it was almost a decade or something until they brought him back. One of the more disturbing things I kind of learned in researching the book was that, quite a few of the soldiers that had served in the Pinochet regime had actually been hired later by Blackwater. So
no.
Yeah.
I mean, I shouldn't say no because, of course, but so these, Jesus Christ. I don't like that.
You love to see it. You love to see it.
Yeah.
When someone, you know what? When someone tells you who they are, believe them.
Yeah, seriously.
And I mean,
oof.
And I mean, it was actually, it's just really weird how Eric Prince did that, because I mean, on the flip side of the coin, you kind of had the same situation in Southern Africa, especially in South Africa when apartheid ended. You had all of these elite troops and what have you. They went
and scientists and bioengineers, of course.
Oh,
That's a lot of people don't know about that stuff.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, they had the whole thing, Project Coast, and see, and this was what was even crazier about all of that is a lot of that was actually overseen by the South African Special Forces. They were the guys working directly with a lot of the Project Coast people.
Wait, what's Project Coast to our listeners?
It was essentially the chemical and biological warfare program that the apartheid government had started to sponsor in the 1980s, but they got into some pretty arcane stuff, and specifically some of the drugs that they researched for quote-unquote crowd control. One of them was ketamine, and another one was MDMA, more commonly known as ecstasy or Molly. And it's really interesting when you kind of look at the timeline of all of this. Of course, the largest anti-apartheid movement in the entire world in the 1980s was in the UK. Under the Civilian Coordination Bureau, South Africa had a lot of their own assets. The Civilian Coordination Bureau was kind of the South African equivalent of Operation Condor. It was designed to go and track opponents of apartheid all over the world. So they have agents, all over Europe. A lot of it is overseen by the South African Special Forces who are working with these Project Coast guys. They start looking into MDMA as a crowd control drug. And then by the late 1980s in the UK, you start having the rise of the whole ecstasy scene, the club scene, the so-called Summer of Love there in 1989, all against the backdrop of, these South African guys lingering in the background. And then the scientist who oversaw Project Coast, he was busted in the 90s for selling massive amounts of MDMA. So it definitely makes you wonder, was there a coordinated effort behind just, UK suddenly being flooded with Molly at the end of the 80s?
One's reminded of the original Summer of Love and the aftermath of that, where drugs flooded. I live here in San Francisco, right down the street from Haight Street Clinic. Listeners, do not read into that. It's a very long street. But same thing here is the government was experimenting with these different drugs, and then all of a sudden you see them flooding the streets.
Yeah, I mean, very much so. And kind of getting back what I was getting to before, I mean, it's unsettling because these guys went into the mercenary industry with executive outcomes.
Yeah.
And then a lot of the guys ended up in another company called Saracen, which Eric Prince started going into business with in 2010.
It's called Saracen?
Yes, it's called Saracen.
They're so on the nose about things. It makes you think that they're just toying with you sometimes.
Well, it's really crazy because I believe
it means Arab.
Yeah, well, and I think they actually set Saracen up, if I'm not mistaken, in like the mid to late 90s, even before the War on Terror got going on. So,
as our good TrueAnon listeners will know, they had been planning that one for about 3 decades.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, it's just amazing when you just look at some of these connections and how, again, you had all of these, fanatical anti-communist regimes in the southern part of Africa and South America and so on, and a lot of the elite troops from these countries just happened to end up in the private military industry going into the early noughts with the global war on terror. And incidentally, Eric Prince was the guy who ended up with a lot of them. And then there was the freaking death squad that the CIA essentially turned over to him. I cannot remember the name of the guy who headed it. It was Enrique something, but he
Hold up, death squad where?
He was an anti-Castro Cuban, okay? He had started out working with the Cuban mafia in the 70s and the 80s, essentially as a hitman, and then the CIA started using him going into the whole Iran-Contra era. He ended up as a major paramilitary officer in the CIA in the 90s, and then, they basically turned him and his network over to Prince and the global war on terror. They claimed that they never used them because, they've decided it was more efficient to use drones to assassinate people. We didn't need this, death squad that the anti-Castro Cuban gangsters set up, at least in theory, but we still gave him to Eric Prince.
That is so, I mean, that's something that I've always been curious about because, we see this post-World War II generation of Nazis, and then the sort of the next generation of basically, what the Nazis became, anti-communist hitmen, assassins, murderers. And, with the end of the Cold War, those guys didn't just all go away, right? Like they spread into their own diaspora, like you're saying.
Yeah, essentially. I mean, it just kind of continued on and on. Of course, I mean, you had to change the conversation a little bit.
Of course.
I mean, anti-communism obviously wasn't that viable with the defeat of the Soviet Union, but I mean, gradually it's kind of shifted into this, anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim thing, and now it's kind of going into hyperdrive with the whole, anti-New World Order stuff. And
Yes.
So, I mean, it's just really incredible, and not in a good way.
No, I mean, it's astounding. I think a lot of people don't understand. A guy that has always sort of linked all these generations to me is Klaus Barbie. Because Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, which I probably butchered the pronunciation of Lyon myself, the Butcher of Lyon, he flees to South America and eventually basically sets himself up as like a cocaine warlord. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was a whole group. I think they called themselves the Fiancés of Death or something like that.
Jesus Christ!
Yeah, no, I mean, so yes, it's all these former Nazis. They brought in these, Italian Neo Fascists. Stefano del Shayak was another guy who was helping them out there too. Yes, actually, I know it was the guy you were talking about earlier, the head of the DINA, who had come out essentially and acknowledged, I think in the early noughts, that he had been handling the cocaine trafficking for Pinochet or something like that. And I believe Stefano was like his contact with the Italian mob. So, yeah, they're doing a little bit of everything on top of the assassinations and everything. Let's sell a little cocaine on the side,
Yeah. I can't remember what I was reading about it, but one of these sort of drug dealers, I don't know if it was on your site or somewhere else, one of these drug dealers eventually opened up a hotel. And by the way, this has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but, it's sort of. Where the main centerpiece was a statue of John Lennon totally nude wearing a Wehrmacht steel helmet.
Oh yeah, that was Carlos Leder, for the Medellin cartel. Yeah, no, I mean he had taken over what was the one island in the Caribbean, the Cays or something. Gosh, I can't remember the name, but yeah, I mean he basically would meet people at the airstrip like in full blown like Nazi uniforms and stuff like that. And they'd all, stand around and give each other, the Heil Hitler salutes and just, there was a book, I think it was John Roberts, the guy who's the Italian mafioso guy who's in the Cocaine Cowboy documentaries or something. And he knew Carlos, he had been there and seen the whole thing. And he's just like, that whole Nazi thing, it makes people nervous or something to that effect.
Yes, it tends to.
Yeah. But, no, and I mean, this guy was from Colombia, and his father, I believe, had been a German or something to that effect, too. So, there's always been kind of this speculation. Well, was he possibly one of those Nazi, tradesmen or something that had immigrated in the post-war years? And Carlos had kind of picked up a little bit of it when he went into drug trafficking.
A little bit of Papa.
Yeah. But,
Eric Prince is a real funny figure, I have to say. I was just thinking about him because it's funny to trace this sort of history where it seems like it is these kind of international networks, but they're very much still tied to states in a lot of ways, right? Even if when they're kind of double crossing each other or whatever, it's these these kind of state sponsored or state adjacent. I mean, even in the case of the mob, right? But now it's Prince is this supranational figure. He has just hoovered up all of these legacies. He's like the Jeff Bezos of militias or something, or mercenaries.
Well, I mean, it kind of seems like, progressively there's almost become, this nationalist international. I don't know what you really want to call it, but I mean, you can really see the cabal in, the kind of SCL group / Cambridge Analytica network. Because, I mean, you start peeling back the layers in that. I mean, you've got the Mercer family involved with that. You've got Steve Bannon. They've got corporate ties to the Frontier Services Group, which is Eric Prince's new mercenary firm. They've got ties to the Flynn Group, which is Michael Flynn's private intelligence group. They've got ties to a bunch of Israeli groups. They've got ties to Palantir, Peter Thiel's group. They've got ties to Epstein via one of those Israeli groups. Gosh, I can't remember the name now.
But, Whitney Webb
Carbine or something. Yeah,
Carbine.
Carbine, yes. I mean, they've got ties to these guys. They've got ties to the Russian oligarchs and what have you. So, I mean, yes, it's just this incredible network where, you see with the British end, you've got, a Mountbatten who was apparently involved with the SCL group. I mean, the Mountbattens, the infamous Lord Mountbatten, that was Prince Philip's uncle, and he's a guy who's been implicated for years in pedophile scandals.
Yeah.
Of course, allegedly he was involved in the whole thing with the Kincora Boys Home scandal. So you've got these British establishment figures linked up to the royal family and what have you involved in it. You've got the Russian oligarchs. You've got the Israelis. You've got these, American ultras like Bannon and Flynn and Prince and what have you. So, I mean, it really is just a smorgasbord of these nationalist elements spread across the world. And, you almost have this you literally have this just highly sophisticated cabal that, is very tech savvy as well. And I mean, I think there you kind of see this aspect, as I kind of talked about before, this psychological warfare aspect that closely aligns with these, special operations and so forth. And you can see it really crystallized in the SCL group and Cambridge Analytica and the ties into mercenary firms like Eric Prince's.
I mean, it's a study. One thing I actually, I'll mention this later, but there's a Ghislaine Maxwell tie too, because her ex-boyfriend, a Knight of Malta, was involved in the Wonga coup. The coup in Guinea.
Are you talking about Simon Mann, maybe?
No. He was a Simon Mann adjacent. His name was Count Gianfranco Cigona Mazzone.
Okay.
He was basically involved and accused of being on the Wonga list for Thatcher's son's coup.
Mark Thatcher, yeah. And see, that had all those, executive outcome guys, too, because Simon Mann had been a major shareholder in executive outcome, and then he had gotten into business with Tim Spicer later with the Sandline Group. Of course, Spicer went on to form the Aegis Company, which is just a huge private military company. But, I mean, that's just interesting, too, that you see Ghislaine Maxwell. But that's not entirely surprising because I believe... obviously, Robert Maxwell had quite close ties to Margaret Thatcher. They apparently got on famously. So
funny for a Labour MP, but I guess certain things know no party.
Yeah, well, I mean, Maxwell was really a creation going back to Sir Charles Hambro, who was a hardcore Tory. But yeah, I mean, it was really just this group of special operations executive veterans surrounding Hambro who basically gave Maxwell Pergamon, gave him all the money to buy it and set it up and what have you. So, yeah, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I believe when Maxwell had originally tried to, run for Labour in the early 60s, there was a lot of suspicion around him because he had pretty much always been associated with prominent Tories and what have you up to that point. So, yeah, it's a big question as to how cosmetic all the labor stuff was. I mean, certainly for a professed socialist, he despised trade unions with a fanaticism.
Yeah, it seemed like very convenient cover, strangely enough.
I always thought my sort of dark horse theory, it's not even a dark horse theory, my regular, tan, sandy-colored horse theory is that he was like, fuck, well, Rupert Murdoch's a right-wing media baron, but that means there's space for a left-wing media baron. I don't actually have to be left-wing, but getting elected as a Labour councillor will certainly help sell some papers.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely something to that, like you're saying. I mean, Murdoch, and then there's also James Goldsmith. I mean, really the big architect of Brexit there. So, I mean, they kind of had the market covered on the right. So, yeah, I mean, Maxwell had to find a niche for himself somewhere, I suppose.
So, we got to wrap up soon, but there's a couple things I want to ask you. I mean, first of all, what we've seen is that there was a giant globe-spanning neo-Nazi intelligence agency network post-World War II. And that network has moved into something else now. Is there still some sort of like globe-spanning network, but what is it?
Well, I mean, I think very much, when we were kind of talking earlier with SCL Group, Cambridge Analytica, I mean, you see, kind of the public face of that. But I mean, certainly now it's much more of a private network, not really, close to the states. And I think, really the big objective of this is ultimately to bring about a kind of neo-medievalism, neo-feudalism, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. But I mean, essentially, I think now, especially with the ratcheting up of tensions with China, I mean, people would love to break China down into multiple different countries. I think there are people here who would love to break the U.S. down into smaller countries. Mm-hmm. And essentially, you remove these obstacles, there's nothing to stop these big multinationals, which already have budgets that are larger than many, countries to begin with. And then, in the case of, Africa and the post-Cold War years, I think you kind of saw the blueprint there. With executive outcomes, the two big guys behind it were Simon Mann and Tony Buckingham. Both of them were special operations veterans, but Buckingham also owned, I think it was like Hermitage Oil. He owned a bunch of diamond companies and what have you. And what he would do is he would go into a country like Angola He'd say, I'd like to buy access to your oil rights, and I'll start paying you guys some generous proceeds for that. Just, the ruling elite, of course, not the general people. And they'd say, well, that sounds great, but, this rebel group controls that area of the country, so we can't really do anything for you. So Tony'd be like, that's no problem. Tell you what, I'll loan you the money, you'll sell me the oil rights, and you can hire my mercenary company. They'll go in and push those rebels right out for you, and then we'll even leave stay-behind troops there to make sure that the oil fields stay liberated.
You gotta love it. That's smart business thinking.
And I mean, I just, that already seems like it's being set up now. I mean, you look at a place like Apollo Capital, which is run by Leon Black, who's been a close friend of Trump's for years now.
Yes, also friend of fucking Epstein.
And a friend of Epstein, yes, absolutely. Apollo owns a company called Constellus, which is the company that currently owns what Blackwater is known as, Academia or X, whatever the heck it's calling itself now.
It's XE. I don't know what the fuck.
Yeah, it's changed its name a couple times.
But Constellus, it owns, the company formerly known as Blackwater, and it owns Triple Canopy, which was another one of the big three private military companies. And then you've got Steven Feinberg, the head of Cerebus Capital. He's currently in the president's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and a guy a lot of people say is going to be tapped eventually to do a review of the intelligence community. Cerebus owns DynCorp.
Right.
So, I mean, you already
we've done an episode on DynCorp before.
So you already kind of have this set up where it's like you've got these big, venture capitalist firms that already own effectively their own private military companies. If we keep going in the place that in the direction it seems like we're going, these companies are going to be able to move in mass and just start seizing resources all over the world with these military firms.
Well, I mean, I know we have to wrap up, but it really reminds me of the East India Company. That's like how it basically will start operating. Right?
Yeah, well, I mean, very much. I think, that's what we're kind of seeing with the mini East India companies being set up in Africa in the 90s. And now, we're getting into the big East India companies in this neo-feudal environment.
Totally.
It is not lost on me that Eric Prince, I believe, didn't he print like an op-ed in the New York Times or something calling for a new East India company? Or at least it was reported that he was talking to Trump about setting up a new East India company in Afghanistan.
Well, yeah, essentially he wanted them to privatize the war in Afghanistan and just, have it totally fought with private military companies. And that's interesting because Feinberg, the guy I just mentioned, will be the one probably tapped to review the intelligence community. He's friends with Eric Prince. In fact, he actually talked about buying Blackwater, I think, in 2010 or something. So these guys are all buddy-buddy. Do you think he's going to maybe listen to Prince's plan when he's talking about reforms? Quite possibly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these guys are pretty much already in place. And, I mean, it's interesting in terms of the COVID situation now, because I know Trump is already using that as another excuse to try to pull our troops out of Afghanistan. So that happens. Chaos breaks out. Who you going to call?
Eric Prince.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I hadn't really thought about that.
He's a dangerous dude. People, he scares me. Well, there's not a lot of people that scare me, but he's on the list.
At least no one else in his family is anywhere close to the halls of power. At least his sister isn't deciding what fucking books your kids read. Recluse. I like saying that more than Steven Snider because it sounds fucking cool.
It does.
I mean, not that Steven Snider doesn't sound cool, but Recluse sounds really cool. I am so glad you joined us. This is fantastic. I'd love to have you on again sometime. Yeah, I will say, anybody out there, you've got to check out you call it VISUP? I always said VISUP, but I also never said it out loud to anybody.
Well, it's not a real word. I mean, there's no real formal pronunciation anyway. But I mean, I always went with VISUP though. But yes, it's VISUP, view, VIEW, all one word, .blogspot.com.
And if you are a TrueAnon listener, this is in your wheelhouse. Please read this website for lots of good stuff on it. Love this series on the occult and special forces. But thank you let's plug the book again. I'm going to have you say it because I can't remember the address to get it at.
Sure. It's Strange Tales of the Parapolitical, Post-War Nazis, Mercenaries, and Others' Secret History. It's available on Amazon and also at our official store, which is The Farm Podcast. That's all one word, thefarmpodcast.store/. And if you aren't tired of listening to me by now, you can also check me out at the podcast, which can be found at thefarmpodcast.com. So, yeah, give us a listen sometime.
Amazing. Yeah, we'll link to all that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Recluse, and we'll see you on the other side. was fantastic.
We gotta do an episode on Eric Prince. We've been talking about that for a while, but we gotta go kind of like deep dive into him. I'm not kidding. There's like, I have a list of maybe like 10 people that like legit scare me in terms of like power and stuff like that, global power, and he's on the list.
We named, or the Recluse named several of those during that last part there. 2 names in particular, Teal and Prince. I think of them basically as if they
Or like a unit.
if they were a bug, they'd be the same kind of beetle.
Bezos is another one on there. I won't reveal. I'll slowly, through the rest of the TrueAnon year, and then some, perhaps I'll slowly reveal my list. My list of scaries.
Yeah. Liz has her list of scares, and I have my list of, let's just say, I won't even make the noise. Let's just say the Belden noise people. And I'm not going to reveal. I'm not going to reveal any of their names. In fact, I won't say anything to them. Let's change the subject. I don't want to get too deep into that, baby.
All right. So I guess we're signing off now, huh?
Yeah, it's good to see. It feels this went by so quickly.
It did.
Well,
But we'll do it again soon.
yeah.
My name is Liz.
I am Brace. We're joined by producer Young Chomsky, who does the music as well.
And we will see you next time. Bye-bye.